Are we ready? Yes? Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute of Ismaili Studies, those attending in person and those attending online, and a special welcome to our panelists and speakers, not quite panelists, but deliverers of testimonials, I guess. Very big professors and some younger scholars. Although, of course, given that life gets longer and scholars work longer, even scholars in the mid-60s are young scholars today.
Very young.
Very young. We are honoring Professor Madelung, his life and his work. This is a humble contribution, but we thought it was necessary to have a small gathering in his honor. If I may share a small personal anecdote, which I hope will be some of the part of the tone of the gathering. When I was about 14 years of age, my sister was studying in Oxford, and he brought me some information and said, there is an amazing professor in Oxford, 1988, WILFERD Madelung. And ever since I heard his name, I wanted to come to the UK to study. Then I heard Farhad Daftary's name, and these two names made me embark in my rihla, in my journey, not to the east, but north, west. There is no fire alarm test, which is planned. So if you hear the fire alarm, please make your way to the exit and down the stairs. We're going to have two panels, two sessions with a break of about half an hour in the middle. My colleague, Mohammad Daryoush Mohammad, sorry, is sitting at the back. He has been preparing this with me all along, and he's going to be controlling the connections online. Many of our speakers are going to be coming in on Zoom, so fingers crossed for the connections to work. Before I ask our director to say some words, I would like to play a little audio of a lecture by Professor Madelung. So the plan is to start by listening to his voice and to end by listening to him. This is a lecture that he gave in UCLA when he received the Giorgio Levi della Vida Award in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. The proceedings of, the lecture is published in a volume called Universality in Islamic Thought, edited by Michael Moroni. And the text is actually the same that you will hear. So if I may ask Daryoush to play the first clip.
Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I think you know already the subject on which I will be speaking, but I read it out once more. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I think you know already the subject on which I will be speaking, but I read it out once more. Universality in Islamic thought, rational theology, and the Mu'tazila. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I think you know already the subject on which I will be speaking, but I read it out once more. Universality in Islamic thought, rational theology, and the Mu'tazila. Aspiration to universality has marked Islam from an early date. At first, the Prophet Mohammed, preached to his own people, the Quraysh, in his hometown, Mecca, and called them to submit to the one and universal God. When he met opposition and persecution, he appealed to other Arab tribes and sought refuge in Medina. He saw himself now as God's messenger to the Arabs, in a line of prophets who had earlier been sent to the Banu Israel and other peoples. When his claim to prophethood was rejected by the Jewish tribes in Medina, he came to recognize his mission as universal to mankind. His message now superseded the messages of the earlier prophets, although these had been valid in their era, and all prophets had been Muslims in their submission to the universal God. The rulers of mankind, whether they had before accepted a divine message or not, were now invited to convert to Islam. The great expansion after the death of Mohammed took place under the banner of Islam. The Arabs, to be sure, were its tool and army. Those who followed the call to join Islam had to be integrated into Arab society, becoming clients or confederates of the conquering tribes. From the perspective of the 19th century Western ethnic nationalism, the Umayyad Caliphate could, with some justification, be seen as an Arab kingdom. Its fall and replacement by an ethnically more broadly based caliphate revealed its underlying universal aspiration. Even when the territories of the caliphate later fell apart, sometimes along ethnic boundaries, the Dar al-Islam, with its claim to submission to the universal God, remained intact. From a different angle, a claim to universality of Islam was put forward in the much debated hadith attributed to Muhammad. Every child is born with the innate sound disposition, al-fitra. Then his parents make him a Jew or a Christian or a Marjan. The natural disposition with which every human is born is towards Islam. Other religions rather estrange him from his inborn constitution. This dictum of the Prophet was generally understood as addressing the question of the status in the hereafter of the children of unbelievers, who were in this world mostly treated by the law as following the status of their parents. For the theologians, it raised problems. Strict predestinarians who held that unbelievers were created from a different clay than the believers could not envisage that the innate disposition of all children was equally sound. The statement could refer only to those children who were predestined for Islam and were in fact created as Muslims, as the unbelievers were created as unbelievers. Those theologians who accepted the universality of the fitra as an innate predisposition to Islam faced the question as to what distinguished it from Islam. If Islam in the full sense was defined as acceptance and practice of the divine law, the Sharia, at the age of discretion, was not the fitra itself already a phase of Islam? There was no conversion necessary at the time of the submission to the obligations of the law of Islam, as there would have been if a non-Muslims accepted the Sharia.
Thank you. We will continue this passage at the very end, but as you can see, the cadence of the words, the rhythm, the choice of the concepts and the words, the careful and methodological and punctilious selection of word after word is characteristic of Professor Madelung's work. If I may ask my colleagues to bring a tablet on the table, yeah, so that we can see the screen. We will now have Professor Zayn Kassam, Director of the IIS. For the information of those online, Dr. Farhad Daftary is the Director Emeritus. But now we have Professor Zayn Kassam, please.
As you all know, I have big shoes to try and fill. As Dr. Daftary cedes his position to me and returns to continuing his thoughtful productions of work. So I'd like to welcome all of you who are present virtually and in person to the Aga Khan Center and the Institute of Ismaili Studies to mark this occasion. It is always a sad day when a shining star in our scholarly firmament departs. And as you know, as scholars, we build on the work of foundational scholars, one of whom, of course, was Professor Madelung. And we start with that foundation. We add to it the best we can with our insights, and we move the work along, as it were. The thing is that even though the star no longer shines in our sphere, it continues to exercise a long light, as it were, through the work and the legacy that is left behind. And that is exactly why we are here today, to honor the memory and the legacy of Professor Madelung, who left us earlier this year. May he rest in peace. Even though this is a sad occasion, our gathering is a celebration of the life and the works of one of the indisputably most distinguished scholars in our field. I cannot for myself imagine, how my understanding, for example, of Imamate grew deeper and with a much better appreciation of the many issues around the institution and how it is recorded and how it is sort of developed over time, had it not been for Professor Madelung's classic essay on the Imamate. As Dr. Daftary shall explain, Professor Madelung's association with the Institute of Ismaili Studies lasted for more than 2 decades. He would be seen to arrive from Oxford every Tuesday regularly, even religiously, if I may say so. I myself never had the good fortune of meeting Professor Madelung, but this is what I hear from person after person who has talked about Professor Madelung, just how gracious he was with respect to sharing his knowledge, how he worked with scholars on manuscripts, how he debated and discussed points that were obscure. So we are really grateful for his immense contribution to the growth of scholars here, as well as, to his contribution to the fields, the many fields in which he worked. As you know, he's had a lasting impact on the study of Ismaili doctrines and history, and his legacy will be long lasting, as I've said. He edited many Ismaili texts which were previously unknown. We at the IIS are committed to inviting academics, young and old, Ismaili or not, to work on manuscripts and to produce scholarly editions, translations, and studies that will further illuminate our history and thought, as well as those of akin communities. As you know, Ismailis have never existed in a vacuum, and so the study of these texts are especially important to try and tease out the connections that on issues that were current in the field, but also within the communities in which Ismailis lived and worked. Professor Madelung's legacy, as you know, extended to many other fields, as our colleagues today will remind us. And I would like to finish by emphasizing one of Professor Madelung's most important traits. Not only was he a methodical and meticulous scholar, working in the isolation of his office, as many of us do, he was also a very active team player. A large number of his publications were the result of his collaboration with others, some of whom are here with us today. Let us celebrate Professor Madelung's contribution to Islamic studies by continuing to bear the torch that he so brilliantly carried and has handed to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kassam. Due to time constraints, I have to force the natural order of presentations, and I would like to call in Professor Roberto Tottoli, who is now Rector of the Orientale University of Naples, who has some busy official meetings this afternoon and has kindly agreed to join us. Please, Professor Tottoli.
Thank you. You can listen to me. I hope so. It's okay.
Perfectly.
It's okay, perfectly. Thank you, Omar, and thank you to all of you for the occasion and the honor to testify and to bring testimony to the significance of Professor Madelung. I would say Professor Madelung's legacy for my institution, first of all, and also for myself as a scholar of Islamic studies. And first of all, I would like to mention somehow how Professor Madelung during his life was really along with the scientific career of many of us here in Naples, where a tradition of studies, I would not mention the term sex, sectarianism, and so on, but the variety of Islamic history as a long Islamic tradition. I would like to mention the beginning of the 20th century when the first manuscripts about Ibadi culture and history were acquired, the name of Roberto Rubinacci, who started his students, Ercilia Francesca, Agostino Cilardo, who passed away not so much time ago, and also the teaching of Carmela Baffioni and all the students around, which is also reflected in the teaching lines today in our institution, where you have really a large spectrum of studies about thought, history, tradition of Islam, and not only Sunni Islam, all the expression of a variety of incredible intellectual variety of Islamic history. For many of us and for many of these scholars, or for many of the students of these scholars, Professor Madelung was really a constant and significant presence during decades. And I also tell you something that nobody knows, that 15 years ago, we had a faculty in Arab Islamic Studies which had decided to give a laurea honoris causa to Professor Madelung, but then a law erased the faculties in Italy. We are now organizing departments, and that occasion to have Professor Madelung here and to celebrate him was, alas, not possible to have. But we went on working, consulting him in his incredible scholarship. I won't take time to list all of his incredible work, cooperating with so many scholars and with a full scholarly life until the last years of his life. One second brief remark regards my career as a scholar in Islamic studies. I had the occasion, not as a rector, happily, because it would have been a little bit embarrassing as a supposedly young scholar, to introduce a conference on Ibadism here, organized by the colleagues. And in the first row, there were Joseph Van Ness and WILFERD Madelung. You know how can it be to declare that I was a scholar in Islamic studies in front of the two pillars of the philological European scholarship on Islam. Both of them have passed away, and I think really there is a passing of generation, and they represented, and Professor Madelung, the first one in this realm, was really the best tradition of philological studies and the capability to decline philology at the service of history of ever going on research. We are really missing him and with Professor Vanessa, the two forefathers and the line connecting the good tradition of philological European tradition to current time. It is up to us to go on. I feel a little bit somehow embarrassed to think about to follow the steps of a giant like Professor Madelung, but really his scholarship will remain in the future and will be something like an inspiration for so many scholars and students. So this is the legacy by Professor Madelung for me and for my institution and all my colleagues working on related and even not related fields of research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Grazie mille, Professor Tottoli, for connecting in a busy schedule with us. We'll let you go and fulfill your official duties. We now move on to Dr. Farhad Daftary. I have to say that we have only been able to gather some of the scholars who have worked with Professor Madelung. For many, it is very emotional. It is very early to speak about the professor, and so we have recorded Dr. Daftary. So we have a nice, seamless narrative on his encounters with Professor Madelung. Please.
Now, as you know, Professor Madelung was born on the 26th of December 1930 in Stuttgart in Germany, the son of a German scientist, and the family after the war moved to Washington, D.C., where his father, like a number of other German scientists, was then working. Madelung briefly attended Georgetown University, then subsequently went to Cairo and studied at the University of Cairo with Professor Mohammad Kamel Hossein, who was interested in Fatimid texts and had an interest in that whole area. And in fact, it was Professor Kamel Hossein who kindled Madelung's interest in Ismaili and Fatimid studies. And so subsequently, when he went back to Germany, he received his PhD from the University of Hamburg in 1957, and he wrote his PhD thesis on early Ismaili doctrines, and on the basis of which he published his first 2 articles in German, both of which were subsequently translated into English. So it was in these 2 articles that Madelung, at the same time as Professor Samuel Stern of Oxford, correctly identified the nature of the early Ismaili movement, and it split, which occurred in 899, into loyal Ismaili and the dissident Karmati factions. Well, Professor Madelung was a friend, a colleague, and also my mentor during my earlier years. We met in connection with the first book, which I was working on, the Ismailis. As you know, I began to write that book in mid-1970s, after some 20, 25 years of research. And by 1985, I had finished the first 3 chapters of the book. So to make sure that I was on the right track, I wanted to bring my work to the attention of Professor Madelung, who was known to me at the time as the foremost expert in the field. He had just, a few years earlier, he had published his article on Ismailiyah for the 2nd edition of Encyclopedia of Islam, which was a very dense article and really took stock of the state of the field. Anyway, through a mutual friend, Dr. John Gurney, who, like Madelung at the time, was affiliated to the Institute of Oriental Studies of Oxford University, I made an appointment with Professor Madelung, and when I left Iran in 1985 for the first time after the Islamic Revolution, I went to Oxford in March of 1985 and had my first meeting with Professor Madelung in his office at the Oriental Institute. He very kindly accepted to review the chapters, the 3 chapters that I had with me. I left the chapters with him, and shortly afterwards he got back to me with some comments, and I really received assurance from him that I was on the right track. And subsequently I sent him the rest of the chapters, and in return he was wondering if I could send him books, Arabic and Persian, from Iran, which I did. Meanwhile, I had become affiliated with the Institute of Ismaili Studies in 1988, so I had occasion to have more meetings with him. And the book that he helped me, and that book was published a bit later in 1990, as you know, by Cambridge University Press, and Madelung kindly agreed to contribute a foreword to that book. And meanwhile, I had joined the Institute, and in 1999, shortly, I think a year after he had retired from his position as the Laudian Professor of Arabic in Oxford, we created for him a position at the Institute as a Senior Research Fellow. And I believe he was the first external scholar to occupy that position, and which was subsequently also awarded to Professor Landolt, and then much later to Professor Amir-Moezzi and Carmela Baffioni. And another academic contact I had with him was in connection with working on a first shrift for him, for which I collaborated with Professor Joseph Mary. And this first shrift, the essays in the first shrift were contributed by a number of his former students and colleagues and so on. And the first shrift was published by the Institute in 2003. And my next academic collaboration with him was in connection with our work for Encyclopedia Islamica, which was really a major collaborative work between the Institute and the Center for Great Islamic Encyclopedia in Iran. We took it upon ourselves to publish an edited, abridged, revised English version of their work in Persian, and Professor Madelung and I functioned as the co-editors of this encyclopedia, the first volume of which appeared in 2008, and some 5 volumes were subsequently published. Briefly, I can sum up as his contributions as follows. The bibliography of his publications numbered to more than 500, out of which some 33, 34 are comprised of monographs, editions, translations, and edited volumes. Some 100 substantial articles and book chapters, many of which have appeared subsequently in 4 variorum reprint volumes. Some 200 encyclopedia entries and articles for other works of history reference, and some 200 book reviews. And in fact, many of his contributions, oddly, did occur in terms of his encyclopedia articles and book reviews. Now, to make a brief, summation of Madelung's contributions, I would say after an earlier German scholar, Rudolf Strothmann. Madelung was the only Western author, or perhaps any scholar of Islamic studies, who made major contributions to the study of all three major Shia communities, the Ethno Asharis, the Ismailis, and the Zaydis, as well as to a vast number of early religious movements in Islam. In fact, we can say that he was really the foremost authority on early Islam in all its branches and intellectual dimensions. His contributions, his original contributions, were twofold. He, who worked very closely with the sources and was actually meticulous in also identifying and using his sources, in the course of his long academic career, especially during the last 2 or 3 decades of it, he identified a number of new Islamic sources which had not been known before. Many of these actually appeared in the editions of the texts that he produced. So that was one whole area of his original contribution. And the second area consisted of his new interpretations of the known sources, the foremost example of which in this category would be his monograph on succession to Mohammad, in which, on the basis of the vast array of known Islamic sources, he came out with a very new interpretation of the whole issue of succession to the Prophet, and in it he really lent the weight of his scholarship, his academic weight, to the Shi'i point of view. And this perhaps was one of the reasons why that book and its Persian translations were so well received in Iran, and for that he received the Best Book of the Year award in Iran. So you see, all in all, I would say he belonged to that rare group of scholars who made major contributions to a variety of fields, and he really did not leave any area of early Islamic studies untouched by his contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I may ask you just another brief question. For a number of years, he was associated with the Institute, and he worked on a variety of texts and translations. Can you tell us a little bit about how that worked? The selection of the texts, who selected them, how did you go and did you go and him about it?
In fact, he was on the editorial board of our Ismaili text and translation series. And he was mainly, actually his main responsibility in that capacity was to identify the texts that needed to be edited. He had two views in this matter. One, he thought that important texts which had not been edited and published before should see the light of day. That was one area. He also was of the opinion that many of the texts that had already been edited and published were of poor quality, especially the ones published in Syria. And he thought it would be as valuable to bring out better critical editions of those texts as it was to publish new editions of texts which had not been published before. So in that capacity, he, over the years, he was very intensively involved in identifying the texts who needed to be published either for the first time or which needed better editions.
Thank you. And with regard to the to the quality of his editions, sometimes it is said that he could spot things that other people could not spot in manuscripts. He was very meticulous. How do you think that came to him? I mean, you mentioned his training in Cairo. He obviously had a innate, attention to detail. How do you judge that?
I personally was always amazed at his attention to the detail. The best example of which is he's the one who made a very significant discovery. Of course, we all know about the Ismaili Qarmati split of 899, and we do in that connection we know that Hamdan Qarmat, the leader of the Qarmati faction, he broke off his relations with Salamiya and the central headquarters of the Ismaili Dawah at the time, and then he disappeared. That's all that we know about him. However, in one of the works that is a geographical work, there is one sentence on the authority of the author's son, who says that Hamdan Qarmat reappeared later under a new name in Egypt as the loyal Ismaili author by the name of Abu Ali. And this sentence had escaped scholars for more than 100 years after the publication of that text. The Suratul Arz. Ibn Hogal was the first edition of it came out, I think, in towards the end of 19th century by the Hoye. And even though this text was available in print for more than 100 years, scholars had failed to become aware of the importance of this one sentence in that work. It was, Madelung who, in fact, who presented a paper at a conference precisely on that point, and then wrote his article for Encyclopedia Iranica on Hamdan Qarmat, in which he, I think, mentions his discovery that Hamdan Qarmat reappeared later as a loyal follower of Abdullah al-Mahdi under the name of Da'i Abu Ali.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Daftary, for sharing your reflections on your relationship with Professor Madelung. What a privilege. This is talking about historians of Islamic history and thought. This is history of Islamic studies and also oral history. So we thank you for your contribution, for sharing your reflections. I'd like to make two comments. I would like to thank our colleagues in the library, the Aga Khan Library, who have helped me this morning put together all of Professor Madelung's book-sized publications. I count 34. I will be displaying them on those tables. They are on that trolley over there. The second comment, so for you to admire them during the break. The second comment is that somehow we had to arrange the speakers, and in the end we decided to arrange them by a bit like the Quran, from longer to shorter, with some exceptions. Okay, so from longer lives to shorter lives. Next speaker is Professor Farouk Topan, who is Professor Emeritus from the Aga Khan University, but of course he has a long relationship with the IIS from almost its very inception, and has also taught for many years at SOAS. So please, Dr. Topan.
Thank you. Professor Zayn Kassam, Dr. Farhad Daftary, Dr. Omar Alí-de-Unzaga, Dr. Daryoush, Mohammad, ladies and gentlemen, both here and online, good afternoon. My talk will be slightly different in the sense that mine will be more institutional rather than textual. And I'm grateful, therefore, for this opportunity to speak a few words about Professor Madelung in relation to the early years of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Excuse me for a while. So looking back, when the Institute of Ismaili Studies was inaugurated in December 1977, many people saw it as an institution, but there were others who perceived it as a novel institution whose vision, whose vision and aims resonated with their own thinking about academic, community, and educational development. Indeed, much thought had gone into the decision to locate the institute here in London. The vision of the founder, His Highness Yahya Khan, and the leaders and scholars who had participated in its founding was to establish the institute as a place of scholarship, education, research, and a platform for free expression and exchange of views. As that vision gradually unfolded in a very rudimentary way in those early years of the late 1970s and early 1980s, I may say, not without difficulty and quite a lot of sort of hiccups, we might say, a number of renowned scholars from established institutions recognized in the IIS a nascent academic institution with a huge potential. They were happy to be associated with it, with its growth, its development, and among them was Professor WILFERD Madelung. And I think in order to paint a fuller picture, I should mention a few of the very first scholars who then came to the Institute and were, if I may say so, friends of the Institute from its very inception, or just a few years after it was established. Among them were Professors Anwar Ishmael, Professor Mohsen Mahdi, whose seminar on Al-Biruni, assisted by Dr. Al-Nur Danani, I still remember, Professor Abbas Hamdani, Professor James Morris, Dr. Daryoush Shaigan, Professor Paul Walker, Professor Punawala, Professor Azim Nanji, and Ali Hassani, and later on, Dr. Aziz Ismail. And also, there were teachers from the community itself who came to the Institute to teach in those early days. But that's another chapter for sort of how the Institute was forged into an institution with input from various sources of learning and at various levels. Now, Professor Madelung participated in the activities of the IAS right from the early 1980s through giving lectures and holding seminars for students, and in his quiet way, offering help and advice when it was needed. He was a great scholar, a great historian, as you all know, and as we've heard. And yet, he was also a humble man. And I would like to end this with an example of his humility, which I saw. Our first group of students came to the IAS in February 1980, and they finished their studies in July 1983, the year of the Civil Jubilee of His Highness. Now, each student was required to write a dissertation, or perhaps we can say a long extended essay on a topic of his choice. One student, she chose actually the speech of Shahristani at Khwarizm, and her supervisor was Dr. Jalal Badakhshani. Now, when she had submitted that, I felt that, and I was a little hesitant to show that to Dr. Madelung. After all, this was a very modest expression of her creativity, having translated the speech and then given it some analysis. To my delight and surprise, perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, Professor Madelung took it, he read it, and he suggested that perhaps it should be expanded and elaborated, and that he was ready to guide that student for it to be actually published. That was a sign of his humility. Of course, that didn't happen. Now we have it, of course, in the book published by Dr. Daryoush. But at that time, because it was Silver Jubilee and all the students had been here for 3.5 years, they were yearning to go home. And this particular student actually got married at that time to another student on the program in July. So I think Shahristani was, of course, not on her mind. But to me, this offer, Professor Madelung's offer, was entirely within his character of humility and caring for scholarship, whatever its provenance. And that to me was the mark, not just of a great scholar, but also of a gentle and caring human being that he was. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that heartfelt testimonial, Professor Topan. And it's true, some of the early students of that first batch of the IIS are here. So we kind of combine, a long pedigree, so we're connected to the Institute and also to Professor Madelung. So now we move online again, hoping to be able to connect with Professor Paul Walker from the University of Chicago. Who has, of course, worked for decades, and who knew Professor Madelung and worked with him and collaborated with him on editions and translations. Professor Walker, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, or good morning here. We're in Chicago. It's just 8:30 or a little bit beyond that. Let me start my account with a little bit of my own personal history. And I go back in my story to 1966. At that point, I had just finished a master's degree in Arabic at the American University in Cairo, where I was introduced to Ismaili studies by Abbas Hamdani, who was teaching at the university at that point. So the next phase for me was to move on to a PhD program. And by great mistake, and I don't know why, I can't quite remember, I chose Harvard as my next place to go. It was not a good idea. Harvard had almost nothing to offer me, and I simply wasted 2 years until I could rearrange my life and move on to the University of Chicago, where I should have been in the first place. because I needed Wilfred Madelung. And I knew that, I just didn't follow through. In any case, I finally arrived at the University of Chicago with a PhD program in Near Eastern languages, and happily had Wilfred Madelung as one of my teachers. Now, strangely, when I went to Chicago, it was partly at the instigation of Mohsen Mahdi. I already knew him, and he arranged for me to be transferred to Chicago. And that was very useful and very nice of him, and I benefited greatly from him. But he finally left and went to Harvard. And at that point, then I was with Wilfred Madelung, where I should have been for all along. Now, when I started my dissertation under his direction, first of all, let me say that I never actually took a lecture course with Wilfred. I don't know why that happened, or I can't now explain. Maybe he didn't teach it in the years I was there. But one of the things I knew that when I came to my comprehensive exams, there would be a question about North Africa and the Shi'is. Now, fortunately, my colleague, student colleague, Tarif Khalidi, had taken just such a course with Wilfred Madelung, and he kept meticulous notes. And he was able to lend those notes to me. I could go through them, and I passed the exam when I saw the question, because I knew exactly what I should say. In any case, that was one of those great good fortunes. Anyway, when I came to writing a dissertation with Wilfred, there were no conflicts or anything. It was working very well. But my impression as I go back these 50 or so years is that I would have a conference with Wilfred on, say, a chapter, early chapter in the dissertation, and most of the conversation consisted of yes, no, yes, no. Some of you who've worked with Wilfred knew and know that he was a little bit unforthcoming with information unless you had pressed the right button. You asked the right question. I spent a lot of time in my sessions with Wilfred in which I'd ask what I thought were almost stupid questions just to see what he would answer. But it was still mostly yes and no. So it was frustrating. But midway through the dissertation, I got a job at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And so we moved from Chicago to Washington. And for the rest of the dissertation, we did it by mail, correspondence. So I would send Wilfred, say, a chapter or something like that, and Wilfred would send back the most wonderful letters. They're just marvelous. 3 pages, single space, with chapter and verse, all the details that he knew from his vast store of knowledge. It was down on a piece of paper. It almost, in some ways, seemed like what I should do is forget the dissertation and publish Wilfred's letters. I still have them. Somebody should publish them eventually. They should go into an archive. They were marvelous. It was great. In any case, after the dissertation and finishing, I went on from the Smithsonian Institution eventually to Cairo, then to Columbia, then to McGill, and so on. We kept in touch, but did not have a great deal of interaction in those years. I'd see him once in a while, but Wilfred, meanwhile, I had moved to Cairo. Wilfred had gone on to Oxford. But one of the facts is that his wife really sort of refused to move herself to Oxford. So she maintained the family home in Forest Park here in Chicago. So Wilfred was still kind of anchored in Chicago as well, but at that time I was not. So eventually my wife got a position at the Oriental Institute in Chicago. We're not allowed to call it the Oriental Institute anymore. It's the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, something like that. In any case, she became director of the museum. And so I, as well, had a base again in Chicago. Even though I was teaching at McGill, I was commuting. And then afterward, I was teaching at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and commuting there. While in Ann Arbor, I started a project based on something I had discovered in a manuscript that Abbas Hamdani was able to let me use. And it turned out to be the chapter on Satans in Abu Tamam's Kitab al-Shajara. I began to put that together as a harisography, and it's extremely important, and it contains really interesting unknown information. Now, at some point, I realized I had so much talent of a certain kind, but I had never encountered most of this kind of information, and the obvious person to have as your advisor, at least, was WILFERD Madelung. But we did even one better. We agreed to work on it together, which was a marvelous benefit for me, because it meant that I could do the spade work on the text then and the translation, and then hand it to WILFERD, and he would go through and make sure it was all correct and above board, both the Arabic and the translation. WILFERD once said that he really didn't like to do translation, but he was certainly willing to fix my translations. A great boon to me. In any case, that started a whole series of projects of the same kind, where I would find and bring to him a text, go and find the manuscripts and prepare a preliminary edition and the translation, and then hand it to him, and he would put in his contribution, which was always absolutely essential. It was a way, I think, in the end, that WILFERD's vast store of knowledge could be spread farther than it would have been if he tried to do all of that himself, which would have been time consuming. So he worked with me in that way, and his knowledge could be, it's like 4 or 5 projects. We had an unfinished one at the end, but it was a great boon to the profession, I must say. And as we noted all along, that WILFERD used the same technique with other people. So, for example, Sabina Schmidtke, in some respects, the same kind of arrangement. Father Martin McDermott in Beirut, who had been a colleague of ours in Chicago. He also was producing texts with WILFERD. Abdurrahman al-Salimi, same thing, more or less, and I think he's going to speak later. And one person we haven't mentioned at all, and a person I don't know personally, is Theodore Abt, who works on alchemy. And it's very useful to remember that WILFERD was a major player in the field of Islamic Arabic alchemy. In fact, I discovered that one of the earliest influences intellectually on WILFERD was Carl Jung and his interest in alchemy. That had gotten WILFERD started long, long ago, and he continued to produce and to study alchemy. He added on to the Abadis all the various fields that WILFERD produced in, but alchemy as well. Okay. One little story about an event when we were in Chicago, the situation was that we were invited to a conference on Abadi studies at the Casa de Velázquez in Madrid. So, and the two of us traveled together by plane to Madrid. We landed in Madrid, we went down into the underground, we traveled through the city, and to get to the Casa, there's a place where you come from a specific station, and you come up and there's no sign of the Casa there at all. You need to know that you go down an alleyway, through a parking lot, around the building, and over this and there, and then you finally get to a walking pedestrian bridge over the expressway. On the other side is the Casa. We did it fast. We're pulling things. WILFERD kept up with me. I was much younger than then, and certainly younger than WILFERD. We got into the Casa and we got into our rooms, and at that point, I got a message or messages from his wife, who was extremely concerned to be sure that Wilfred was okay. She wanted him desperately to call her. Apparently, he had come down with a bad case of shingles. He didn't know it. He didn't show any sign of it. We managed all that travel to Madrid, through Madrid, over the things, and all around the city. I never saw any sign that he flagged at all. There was no sign that he suffered from this illness. But apparently he was sick and stricken. It just didn't show. In any case, we've produced all of these texts that I say, and it was a continuous thing, and it would always sort of be connected. He would come to Chicago about Thanksgiving time, late November, stay through Christmas and into January. One of the things, if you went to his house at that point, was that he was in the process of making Christmas cookies. There was a whole series of traditional Christmas cookies, which Wilfred baked himself. And so you'd go out and we'd have coffee and I'd get a little selection of Christmas cookies. And then we'd discuss whatever manuscript we were working on. It was a marvelous kind of an arrangement. And the fact that we were both in Chicago meant we could usually get together in that way. Although one time we were just finishing the advent of the Fatimids and we needed one last meeting. And in my house, the snow was 2 feet deep. I couldn't get out of the house. There was no way I could get out to Wilfred to consult with him. We just had to skip that particular one. But in any case, those events I remember fondly. And I will kind of conclude with one last one. When we were working on this last publication of ours, which is what had happened is I went to see him and he said that he had, somewhat in excitement, that he had just discovered this text. He had read an article by Michael Pragal on this manuscript in the British Library. And so this, in contrast to the way we normally proceeded, Wilfred himself got the photocopy of that particular manuscript. And instead of letting me work on it first, he actually hand copied the whole thing. He wrote out his own copy of it. And then he handed me both the photocopy and his personal hand copy for me to then type and put in the text and begin the translation. Wilfred was capable of doing that. He was so intense. I remember a story he told about going to the Yemen. And in the Yemen, he had a few days there. He came upon a manuscript he knew about, but had not actually been able to see the whole of it. But he was given access to it. What he did is he hand copied day and night that manuscript and brought it back so that he could then edit it. It was, I assume, a Zaidi text, but I'm not sure. But he was that kind of intense person. So in the case of this one, the British Library manuscript, which is in terrible shape, it lacks its beginning, it lacks its end. There are places in the middle where there are breaks. There are parts that are extremely hard to read. But at some point, we're sitting there discussing it, and his wife joined us. And we were all musing about this. And I remarked about how difficult some of this manuscript was to read. And Margaret, his wife, who one has to remember was a noted authority in her own right, a scholar, a specialist in Icelandic sagas, which she published and a number of things. And she said in reaction to, well, this is hard to read. And she said, but Wilfred can read anything. Now you can take that in several ways, any language, any state of the manuscript, all kinds of things. And I will add one finally judgment about Wilfred. Quite a long time ago, Joseph Furness came to Chicago to give a lecture. And I was alerted to his coming and I planned this carefully. I invited him to dinner at my house so that I could discuss with him that hairosography that I mentioned earlier. And at some point in our discussion, Farhad himself began a sentence of the following: since everything Wilfred says is true, ... I can't remember what the rest of the sentence is. I don't even know if the context is clear, whether he meant a little irony in that statement or not. But there is a judgment of Wilfred by Farhad. So in the end, we can conclude maybe Wilfred was a man who could read anything and a scholar whose every word was true. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Walker. Lovely to see you again. And thank you so much for so kindly sharing with us all those experiences that go back to your student times and that have remained with you for so many decades. Thank you so much. We now move on to our last contributor for this block, Professor Etan Kohlberg, who is also connecting online. Professor Emeritus at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Kohlberg, the floor is yours. There you are. Not sure if you if you can lower the camera slightly, we can see just ever so slightly. That's much better. Yes. Perfect. If you can unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words in memory of Professor Madelung. And I think I read my comments from the page. I can't do what Paul just did, which is very impressive. My first meeting with Professor Madelung took place in Oxford, a year or so after the sudden passing of Samuel Stern in October 1969. Stern had been the supervisor of my doctoral dissertation, and following his untimely death, I found myself having to continue largely on my own. It was during that challenging time that I was fortunate in benefiting from help and encouragement from Professor Madelung. Madelung read drafts of my dissertation and offered valuable comments and suggestions which greatly helped improve my text. We kept in touch over the following years, with Professor Madelung sending me offprints of his many articles and encyclopedia entries and book reviews. It was a pleasure and a privilege for me to see him whenever I visited Oxford. We usually got together in his office at the Oriental Institute, recently renamed the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. On one particular occasion, I refrained from knocking on his door after being advised that he was hard at work on a major study. I did, however, come to the building in Pusey Lane to see my friend Fritz Zimmermann. As Fritz and I were standing outside Fritz's office, Madelung emerged smiling from his own office and informed us that he had that morning completed the manuscript of his book, The Succession to Mohammad, rightly celebrated as one of his major scholarly achievements. I was glad to have been there for the occasion. For 5 months, beginning October 1st, 2002, Madelung was a member of a research group at the Institute of Advanced Studies of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And a few years later, he returned to Jerusalem as a member of another research group, which convened for an entire academic year. During that time, we met regularly at the university. And in addition, my wife and I were pleased to welcome him several times to our home, once in the company of his wife, Margaret. During my visit to the Institute of Ismaili Studies in October 2018, I had lunch with Professor Madelung, though he was more frail than when I'd last seen him. He was as sharp and alert as ever. It was a relaxed occasion, and Madelung seemed in a good mood. Sadly, this was to be our last meeting. Madelung was one of those rare scholars who single-handedly transformed an entire field. The scope and breadth of his scholarship, as already mentioned, are truly astounding. He had a gift for identifying important and interesting subjects, including some that had not been previously touched upon. All I can do here, in addition to referring briefly to his achievements as editor, is to mention a few of his early articles on aspects of Imami or Twelver Shi'ism. His first articles in this area were published in the 60s and 70s of the previous century, at a time when little work on Shi'ism was being carried out. In his articles, he dealt with major aspects of Imami Shi'ism, including history, doctrine, law, and literature. In his first study of this kind, Bemerkungen zur imamitischen Firak-Literatur, dating back to 1967, translated into English as Some Remarks on the Imami Firak Literature, Madelung discusses two early Imami heresiographies. These are the Kitab Firak al-Shia by Hassan ibn Musa al-Nawbakhti and the Kitab al-Maqalat wal-Firak by al-Nawbakhti's contemporary Sa'ad ibn Abdullah. The two texts exhibit considerable overlap, and the particular problem addressed by Professor Madelung was the relationship between them. Madelung shows that Sa'ad wrote his book several years after al-Nawbakhti and used the latter's work as a basis. He then suggests that al-Nawbakhti's source for the first half of his book was the Ikhtilaf Anas fil Imama by the 2nd, 8th century Imam Mutakallim Hisham ibn al-Hakam. Madelung next notes that Sa'ad's text includes numerous insertions and suggests that many of these were taken from two sources which have likewise not come down to us, Abu Isa al-Waraq's Kitab al-Maqalat and Yunus ibn Abdurrahman's Kitab al-Rad al-Ghulat. Building on a solid textual basis and a careful reading of the sources, Madelung here offers bold and convincing hypotheses. The Bemerkungen article was followed in 1970 by Imamism and Mu'tazilite theology, in which Madelung traced with admirable clarity the evolution of Imami theology from radical opposition to Mu'tazilism to the adoption of major Mu'tazilite tenets by al-Mufid and al-Murtada in the 10th and 11th centuries. In his study, Shi'i Attitude Towards Women as Reflected in Fiqh, published 9 years later, Madelung pointed out that the main points of difference between Imami fiqh and the Sunni schools of law concern the rights of women in marriage and inheritance. Madelung typically goes beyond the presentation of the material and offers an explanation for this difference between Imami and Sunni law. He concludes the article with a brief summary of the views of the Zaydis and Ismailis. Here again, a relatively short article is packed with a great deal of valuable information and analysis. Another legal topic is tackled by Madelung in his article, A Treatise of al-Sharif al-Murtada on the legality of working for the government, Mas'ala fil Amal ma'a Sultan, published in 1980. In the first section, Madelung provides the background to al-Murtada's text, the problem of serving under an illegitimate government. As Madelung shows, this question is discussed in numerous hadith and was relevant both during his lifetime, the lifetimes of the Imams, and following the occultation. The main part of the article consists of an edition and translation of Murtada's treatise. Madelung based his edition on manuscript 5187 of the Majlis Library in Tehran, which was the only witness of this work available to him at the time. Madelung entered 48 emendations to the text. A comparison of his edition with a later publication of al-Murtada's text based on a different manuscript reveals that a large percentage of his emendations, in fact forms part of the later publication. In the concluding section, Madelung succinctly and brilliantly presents the main elements of al-Murtada's thought. Al-Murtada's epistle is one of numerous texts which Professor Madelung edited, as already mentioned. I would like to conclude my brief remarks by mentioning his edition of a much longer work, the Kitab al-Najat by the Zaydi Imam Ammar Lidin Allah. This work by Sanut al-Hadi, the founder of the Zaydi Imamate of the Yemen, is a refutation of an anti-Qadarite tract composed not long after 179-795 by the Ibadi theologian Abdullah ibn Yazid al-Baghdadi or al-Fazari. Madelung was the first to study this text and place it at the disposal of the scholarly community. The text is clearly important. First, the Ibadi tract, largely reproduced by Nasser, is one of the earliest extant works of Kalam. And second, the Zaidi refutation, though it is not the earliest available exposition of anti-Trinitarian views, is extremely detailed and enriches considerably the information given in the heresiographies. The edition is based on two manuscripts. One is dated 565 and forms part of the Glaser collection in Munich. This manuscript suffers from a lacuna consisting of almost a quarter of the text. The second manuscript forms part of the Mutawakkiliya collection of the Mosque of Sana'a and is dated 548. In this manuscript, the text is preserved in its entirety. The edition is a model of clarity and precision, with the editor's sure hand evident throughout. To give just one small example, in both manuscripts, Quran 47, verse 4 reads, "Alladhina qatalu fi sabilillah," and those who fight in God's way, in conformity with the qira'ah of 5 of the 7 canonical readers. Yet in his edition, Madelung rightly places in the text the alternative reading, وَالَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, those who are killed in God's way. In the accompanying note, he writes, the reading قَاتَلُوا is well known, yet the context requires reading قُتِلُوا. Many further examples could be given. To me, as to many others, Professor Madelung has been, and will always be, a brilliant and inspiring scholar and teacher. He will be greatly missed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kohlberg, for your comments and for going into the details of really why Madelung is so amazing, especially working with those manuscripts and those minutiae of the readings, of which many of us have some experience in working with Professor Madelung, indirectly or directly. We have 10 minutes before our break, and so I'd like to invite the audience or even the panelists, whether those in the room or those online, if you would like to make some comments or make some connections as to what has been discussed. Raise your hand if you, okay, if while you think about it. I would say, again, a personal connection, if I may. I came to the UK because of Dr. Daftary and Professor Madelung, and I ended up in Cambridge, beginning my PhD with Tarif Khalidi, who had been a student of Madelung, as was mentioned, and I finished my PhD with Professor James Montgomery, who is here with us, who had also been a student of Professor Madelung. So I think it's really remarkable how, and looking at Professor Walker's story and Professor Kohlberg's story, connecting with Samuel Stern and all those giants, how many decades and how many generations of students he has, been in touch with. So that's really remarkable. Right. Anybody wants to say something? We do have a break. We can take an early break if you want. I'm going to spend some time in the break to arrange the books that we have there. I think all of the books that have been mentioned so far are with us. Only 3 books I couldn't find in the library, which means that they're being used by someone. If you're using one of them, please make yourself known. But yeah, that's a good sign. That's a good sign. Okay, I think we can take a break if there are no questions. We'll see you at the hour at 4 o'clock. Thank you. It's my pleasure to now start the second panel, the second session, the second block. I'm happy to report that we had about 40 people in the room and 40 people connecting online. So it's an event attended by 80 people, and obviously we will try to make this available in some form or another for posterity. I'd like to now bring in Professor Carmela Baffioni. She is Professor Emerita from the University of Naples and also a Senior Research Associate at the IIS. Professor Baffioni, we can see you. The floor is yours.
Many thanks. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dear friends, it was a great honor for me to be invited to commemorate Professor Madelung, and I do so with immense pleasure. I think I remember having first met Professor Madelung at the 15th Congress of the Union Européenne des Arabisants et Islamisants in Utrecht in 1990, September, or 4 years later on the same occasion in St. Petersburg. It was a great emotion for me to see him because he represented a true myth. From the beginning, Professor Madelung was truly kind to me, and from then on, seeing him at these UAI congresses was a real feast. And indeed, he enjoyed them very much. I remember once he tried to convince Sabine Schmidtke to join us, but she did not like this proposal. His affability towards me was certainly enhanced by the presence of his wife, Margaret, who was extremely affectionate and with whom I used to have long chats. In the 90s, my interests were not yet focused on Shiism and Ismailism. Therefore, I was not so familiar with his masterful research, so thorough and full, with historical but also theoretical considerations and insights. Later, I carefully read many of his publications, and I particularly benefited from his seminal The Succession to Mohammad, his articles on the relationship between Mu'tazila and Shiism and on Carmatians, his edition of Sajrat al-Yaqin with Paul Walker, and his edition of Rutbat al-Hakim that I received from him as a gift. In time, Madelung must have also been acquainted with my work, and so at the UAI congresses, we also talked about research issues. In recent years, our scientific relationship has greatly grown, and the Institute of Ismaili Studies that welcomed me as a senior research fellow in 2012, thanks to Dr. Daftary, is to thank for that. When he knew I was coming to London, Professor Madelung looked me up on Tuesdays as soon as he arrived at the Institute, and we had lunch together. On one of these occasions, he gave me the book edited by Moroni that Omar mentioned at the beginning this morning. He would also tell me about his beloved Oxford and the trips he took with his wife. I remember one in the Lake District region, and also with his son. It was a great honor to have appointed Professor Madelung as a member of the Ambrosiana Academy of Milan in the Arabic section of our Oriental class. But the greatest honor was done to me by him when Professor Madelung agreed to introduce the volumes published in my honor by the Università L'Orientale in 2018. When I heard this, I was deeply, deeply moved. After his wife's passing, Professor Madelung seemed to have recovered, to my astonishment, because this is very difficult, especially for scholars of that generation after a lifetime passed together. And it pains me deeply to think that his last years were so difficult. As some of you already know, I would very much like that his last papers presented at recent IIS conferences, in case they have been preserved, are taken up and studied by us. I'm convinced that they still have much to reveal to experts in the field. I refer in particular to his paper on the short writing Kitab al-Asrar attributed to Imam Abdallah al-Mahdi Billah, the manuscript of which is preserved at the IIS. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Baffioni. You have been very kind with us as much as Professor Madelung was kind with you, and both of you actually have been very kind individuals to others, to a younger generation. So we thank you both. We now move to Professor Muhammad Ali Amir-Moezzi. We have a pre-recorded video. Unfortunately, he's unable to join us live because of his troubles. He's professor at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in France and also a senior research fellow at the IIS.
The first time I met Professor Madelung was in the mid-80s during a few trips to Oxford when I was starting to write my PhD thesis. I was able to attend a few of his lectures and discuss questions of method and sources with him. His work had always inspired me, and his great rigor as historian, like that I found in the work of Joseph Van Es and Etan Kohlberg, was for me a necessary complement to Henri Corbin's phenomenological approach. This is why, from the beginning of my studies on Shiism, I considered these four scholars to be my four masters. My relations with him became more friendly thanks to our reunion in the early 2000s at the Institute for Advanced Studies of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where we were meeting along with other colleagues and friends, including Sabine Schmidtke or Rainer Brunner, as part of a research program on Shiism organized by Etan Kohlberg and Meir Barasher. It was after the 6-month stay, when we were next door neighbors, that I took, with his permission, the liberty of calling him by his first name, WILFERD. Then, from 2005 onwards, along with Herman Landolt and the late Mohammad Ahkoun, we both worked in the academic department of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. I had the privilege of meeting him fairly regularly at the IIS, where he came from Oxford almost every Tuesday, so that I could keep abreast of his work in progress and benefit from his advice, which was always useful for my own research. Another place where WILFERD and I met from time to time was the Ambrosian Academy of Milano, where we were both members along with other friends and colleagues, including Dr. Farhad Daftary, and of course, Dr. Carmela Baffioni, who has now also joined the IIS. However, I must add that despite his simplicity and availability, I always kept with WILFERD the relationship of a student with his. WILFERD Madelung's work has always seemed to me to be similar to that of the Islamologist and Orientalist of the late 19th and early 20th century, because of its impressive breadth and the number of fields it covers. In a way, Professor Madelung belonged to the generation of scholars who were not characterized by their ultra-specialization in a specific and very limited area of Islamic studies. As is well known, his work encompassed fields as vast as the theology of the Kalam, Quranic exegesis, history, genealogy and prosopography, philosophy, heresiography, and the history of texts. He was well aware of the extent to which these fields are often organically linked to one another, and that a proper understanding of one of these fields requires an understanding of the others. And despite the breadth of these fields of research, he did not allow himself the slightest inattention The hallmark of his work was its surgical precision, rigor, and ironclad methodological soundness. The late Patricia Crone once told me that she had found small errors of reference or approximations in all the great names of Islamic studies, including herself. We all remember her sense of self-mockery, except in WILFERD Madelung. She jokingly added that from this point of view, Madelung seemed to her to be an abnormal creator. To this vast knowledge of the various fields of Islamic studies and this acribia was added a philological science of the Arabic language, making Madelung an admirable editor of text. He edited many of them, and each of these critical editions, either by himself or sometimes in collaboration with a colleague, is an excellent model of its kind. WILFERD himself admits that his favorite field of investigation is Shia Islam, again in all its breadth and diversity. Few specialists have such expertise as he does in the different intellectual fields of the various branches of Shiism, Zaydism, Ismailism, and Twelver Shiism. As far as I am concerned, and I'm sure that for any scholar in the field of Shia studies, Madelung's work, in particular his collection of articles published in the Variorum series, are literally my bedside. The same goes for the book I consider to be a decisive masterpiece of erudition, methodological rigor, and historical fineness, The Succession to Mohammad. This book, based on an impressive number of sources of all kinds and on a very detailed critical analysis of their contents, seems to show convincingly that from different points of view, historical, anthropological, or religious ones, Muhammad's successor could be none other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. This is why a number of reviewers of the book have seen in it a wild apology of Shiism. When you know Madelung, you realize the absurdity of such a statement. I owe this book a huge intellectual debt. It forms a kind of backdrop for several of my works. For example, my study of the expression Din Ali, Religion of Ali, or several chapters of my latest book, Ali-de Religion of Ali, or several chapters of my latest book, Ali, the Well-Guarded Secret. And yet, and I say it with humility, WILFERD and I did not always agree on the fundamental worldview of Shiism. We had discussed this on several occasions, first in Jerusalem and then in London, in our joint office at the IIS on Euston Road. For me, what specifically characterized Shiism from its earliest sources is the spiritual and mystical dimension of the figure of the Imam, with its initiatory and esoteric consequences. For him, Shiism is marked by its rationalist theology and the legal consequences of this theology. He recognized the solidity of my documentation and the relevance of my conclusions, which was a source of pride for me, but he thought that the esoteric data were superstitious and constitute a kind of contamination of the rational corpus of Shiism by the popular beliefs of the Shia extremists, the famous Ulat. In my opinion, he seemed to adopt the point of view of medieval heresiographers and or apologists, both Sunni and Shi'i, especially in the post-Buwayhid period, a point of view that I consider to be uncritical enough about the late Shi'i tradition. And it seems to me that the Gnostic and esoteric data of Shiism are the heritage of some of the most important and learned philosophical and mystical traditions of the late antiquity. In this respect, Madelung also disagreed with some of Heinz Halm's works, to which I often feel very close. Despite these differences, we sincerely liked each other, and we were in deep agreement that Shia studies are the most fascinating field of Islamic studies. May he rest in peace. As it said in Persian, his place will always be empty among his friends, but his considerable body of work will always remain a reliable source of inspiration and the mine of documented information for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Amir-Moezzi for sending this testimonial, which also talks about how Dr. Farhad Daftary and the IIS have become, in the late part of the 20th century, a hub, an intellectual hub that has attracted these great minds, and a true testimony to the work of all of them. We now move to another of Professor Madelung's students, Professor James Montgomery. He is the Sir Thomas Adams's professor at the University of Cambridge. This is one of the oldest, this is the oldest chair of Arabic in England, which was created in 1632. And if I'm not mistaken, Professor Montgomery is the 24th holder of that chair, which he has held for about 11 years now. So please, Professor Montgomery, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon to celebrate this amazing legacy of a unique scholar. It is true that I was a student of Professor Madelung's, but he never became my Doktorvater, as the Germans say. He never became the father of my doctorate. So in anthropological terms, he was a Doktorvater manqué, a frustrated Doktorvater. I would like to explain how this came to be by telling you the story of the sort of misadventures of a 22-year-old trying to begin a PhD 40 years ago in 1984. I first saw Professor Madelung in September of 1984 at the Universidad de Málaga. I'd just graduated with a degree in Greek and Arabic from the University of Glasgow. I had won a scholarship to study for a PhD in Arabic at Balliol College, Oxford. In advance of my move to Oxford, I decided to attend my first major international conference, the Union Européenne des Arabisants et Islamisants that Professor Baffioni mentioned. That's the European Union of Arabists and Islamicists. It was, I guess, at the time, the sort of European equivalent of what MESA is in the North American Academy. I remember the occasion when I first saw him very, very well. It was a hot, late afternoon in a lecture hall with poor acoustics, no sound system, and all of the windows were open. Those who have been lucky to talk to Professor Madelung will know very well that he was extremely soft-spoken, and his paper was entirely inaudible, drowned out by the noises of southern Spanish evening life as people awoke from their siesta and the traffic began to get going. I did not meet Professor Madelung on that occasion because I had been interviewed for my scholarship at Oxford by Alan Jones, the late Alan Jones, who was the poetry expert at the Oriental Institute in Pusey Lane. And I naively presumed that I would be working with the poetry expert because I was interested in studying Arabic poetry. In fact, my degree subject was the pre-Islamic panegyric. You can imagine my surprise a day after I arrived in Oxford when I went to the Porter's Lodge, and in my pigeonhole there was a handwritten note from the Laudian professor, Professor Madelung, requiring me to attend the following Monday at 11 a.m. in his room in Pusey Lane. I was completely baffled as to why the famous Laudian professor, such a renowned expert in Islamic history, early Islamic Iran, Arabic theology, Shi'i and Ismaili studies should want to meet with me. I mean, what on earth would you want to spend his time meeting with me? But of course, I attended the meeting as I was requested. And at this meeting, Professor Madelung informed me that he would be my supervisor and that he looked forward to working with me. He was extremely courteous and polite, but also very firm. He requested that I attend the following Monday, same place, same time. Professor Madelung met with me every Monday at 11 a.m. and the meetings lasted for exactly 15 minutes. Now, after my second meeting, there were no clocks in his room, but he knew when 15 minutes were up and he would say to me, "Thank you very much. I will see you next week." And after a couple of these meetings, when I went outdoors, there was a clock in the hallway. And I looked at it and I thought, 15 minutes, that's amazing. Every week, I got 15 minutes of his attention. Each week, I'd update him on my progress and he'd listen very patiently. He rarely ventured any comments, as we heard from Professor Walker earlier. I'm not sure that I rose to a yes or a no. So unlike Professor Walker, it was more of a monologue on my part. At first, of course, I found this quite disorienting. Gradually, I got used to it. And the academic year progressed. I turned up every Monday morning for 15 minutes, told him what I'd been up to during the week. And he would say, "Thank you, see you next Monday." And off I would go. But towards the end of the academic year, during these regular meetings, he asked me to attend the Institute Library the following Saturday at 9 a.m. He told me he had to set me an examination to determine whether I could be registered formally for the PhD. I'd had no advance warning beyond being told on the Monday that I was due to be examined on the Saturday. I was not told what form the examination would take. I was not told whether it would be viva or written or anything. I was just told to turn up, which I did. Professor Madelung met me at the library, which he had reserved exclusively for me because it was an examination. So there was no one else in the room. He told me I had 3 hours and I had all the resources of the library at my disposal. He gave me a copy of a diwan of a pre-Islamic poet in which he had sourced a poem that had not been translated into English or German or French or any other European language. And he told me that I should produce a translation of this. And as I said, he would be back at 12 o'clock to see how I got on. I managed to produce a translation of the poem. I think I finished it. I can't quite remember. Professor Madelung, without any comment, accepted my handwritten translation and said, "I will see you on Monday at 11 a.m. as usual." When I turned up on Monday, he gave me my work back. He had covered in pencil the pages of my handwritten translation with notes, suggestions, corrections, of course, and comments. But also, he congratulated me on the job I had done. I not only felt flabbergasted, I felt extremely honored and flattered. The meeting was a decisive moment for me because it was at that point that I gained a vital insight into my supervisor's value system. What mattered first and foremost, as I see it for Professor Madelung, was a command of Arabic. Theories, views, propositions were effectively undetermined at best and superfluous at worst, unless and until they were corroborated by a demonstrable grounding in Arabic. I then understood that he and I shared the same commitment to acquiring as good a grounding in Arabic as possible, for without it, so many of the classical Arabo-Islamic intellectual and aesthetic traditions simply cannot be fully appreciated. This insight over the years has led me to perceive what I think is the second component of Professor Madelung's madhab, a recourse to and reliance upon manuscripts, the insistence not only on making previously unedited works available or improving previously badly edited works, as we've heard from some of our colleagues in the first panel this afternoon, but for me, it's the quest to penetrate the textual barrier to an understanding, in Professor Madelung's words, of history as it really is. His method for penetrating this textual barrier was, paradoxically, to acquire an extensive grounding and immersion in that very textual barrier. Of course, Professor Madelung would not really have approved of me putting it like this. He was uninterested in any fancy theorizing. As I said at the start, I never completed my Oxford PhD. At the end of the second year of my study, I was appointed to a lectureship, and this disqualified me from being in standing to submit my dissertation because I was no longer resident in Oxford. And in the end, I submitted a different PhD as a member of staff in my new institution. So if I'd finished my Oxford PhD, Professor Madelung would have been my Dr. Vater. In the end, I completed a PhD without a supervisor and so became Dr. Vater to myself. My subsequent encounters with Professor Madelung were largely accidental. They usually occurred on my visits to Oxford and almost always in the library of the Oriental Institute or in the senior common room of St. John's. He kindly attended a conference I co-organized at Cambridge in honor of the American scholar Richard Frank, and he contributed his paper to the volume I edited. In our email exchanges and meetings, I could never muster the courage to address him by his given name. He always remained Professor Madelung to me. The last time I met him was over lunch in St. John's College. I had been visiting my good friend, Gert-Jan van Gelder, Professor Madelung's successor as Law Dean Chair. Professor Madelung happened to join us for lunch. My wife was there too, and I noticed that she was looking at me a bit strangely. Out of the blue, Professor Madelung remarked that he had read my latest article on al-Jahid. I was transported back to 1984 on Monday mornings at 11 a.m. It was as if the veils of time had been put to one side. Of course, as was his quiet way, Professor Madelung ventured no further comment. By now, I had realized that for him, silence was approbation. But after the lunch, my wife Yvonne teased me, saying that I had immediately reverted to being a 22-year-old graduate student when Professor Madelung joined us. She even said that I was blushing and stammering when I was trying to talk to him. Omar has asked me to attempt an assessment of Professor Madelung's contribution to our subject. I do not think that any human being other than Professor Madelung has read every word that Professor Madelung ever wrote. It simply would be impossible. All I can say is that in the course of conducting my own research, especially on the relationship between al-Jahid and the early Kalam, and in my work with David Bennett on Ashari's Maqalat al-Islamiyin, I've read a good number of Professor Madelung's works. And the task is indeed extremely, how can I say it, daunting, if not impossible. We've heard much today about the many different aspects of this extremely versatile and meticulous scholar. In the works that I'm familiar with, and this is corroborated by what I heard in the first panel and in the previous contributions, he left virtually no stone unturned in his quest to uncover the relevant connections, filiations, contacts, divergences and doctrinal nuances. And he was, one of the things I admire the most is that he was relentless in establishing a historically accurate prosopography of significant individuals. You had to know who the person was with a degree of verifiable accuracy in order to understand the context in which those ideas were explicated. And that was one of the keys to building, one of the blocks in which one could then build the subsequent academic edifice. The book I'm most familiar with, of course, is the one that we've mentioned, had mentioned a number of occasions, the Succession to Mohammad. I find this book, like Professor Madelung in a sense, and this is a term of praise, unapologetically old-fashioned in its methodology. 2 decades after the iconoclasm of Patricia Crona's and Michael Cook's Hagerism, 2 decades of controversy over the tendentiousness, reliability, and falsifiability of the source material, amid the hurricane of disagreements over optimistic and skeptical approaches to the early history of Islam, Professor Madelung calmly and convincingly rewrites the history of the early caliphate and its main protagonists. This is narrative history, a telling of the story as it really was, but it is also revisionist history, because in the process, he rewrites a century of received scholarly wisdom on the events that led to the takeover of the caliphate by the Umayyad dynasty. After retirement, Professor Madelung, as we've heard, was extremely prolific and generous with his time in collaborating with other colleagues in the editing of manuscripts. There's one of his publications that I would like to mention because I have a personal connection with it. I hope that this publication may help solve a puzzle. I was rather surprised, as Professor Walker mentioned earlier, to see that some of Professor Madelung's most recent publications are editions of Arabic alchemical texts, a series, as Professor Walker told us, that he collaborated with Theodor Abt, who is a Jungian analyst. On a Monday morning 40 years ago, I mentioned to Professor Madelung that I had been reading the works of Carl Jung and enthusiastically wondered if I could develop a Jungian analysis of pre-Islamic poetry. My musings did not find a receptive audience. So I was left wondering, after so many years, had Professor Madelung developed an interest in Jungian psychology? We know from Professor Walker now that he had, but it's not the only reason, I think, for his connection with the Corpus Alchemicum Arabicum. I think one of the answers can be found in his edition of the Epistles of the Brethren of Purity, the IIS series that I'm very honored to have contributed to. And I refer in particular to the volume on God and the World. That's the edition and translation of Epistles 49 to 51. The volume is very dear to me personally, for I have connections with 3 of its contributors. Epistle 51 is edited and translated by my friend and former doctoral student, Dr. Nohar Shah. Epistle 49 is edited by Professor Madelung and translated by Dr. C.J. Uy. I supervised C.J. for a Cambridge MPhil on the Brethren of Purity, and he and I had worked together on the translation of the epistle. We had begun working together on the edition of the text when I had to withdraw from the project. I was delighted to learn later that CJ had been given the chance to work with and learn from Professor Madelung. So this is a book that intersects with me in many surprising ways. I find an answer to Professor Madelung's interest in alchemy in his note on the text to Epistle 49. He identifies one of the authors of the epistle as Maslama bin Qasim al-Qurtubi, the author also of the alchemical text, the Rutbat al-Hakim. This, of course, is one of the texts Professor Madelung edited for the alchemy series. So whether Professor Madelung developed an interest late in his life, again in Jungian psychology, I find moot. I suspect that once again, he was simply chasing down clues and tying up loose ends, another indication of his implacable scholarly rigor. Dr. Omar also asked me to say a few words about Madelung's, Professor Madelung's legacy, and I will try to do that as I conclude. We've heard mention of him in the company of Professor Dr. Joseph Van Es, whom we used to refer to as Sheikh Yusuf. Affectionately, it wasn't a term of disparagement. But I would also like to mention Professor Madelung along with the American scholar of the early Kalam, Richard Frank, because the three of them together brought the study of early Islamic doctrines into the modern era. And they all paved the way for the resurgent interest in the modern academy in theological schools, doctrines, and systems. I've been very fortunate in my career to have known all three of them personally and to have collaborated or corresponded with all three of them. The one accomplishment that I think that all three of them shared was the thing that I think characterized for me Professor Madelung's scholarship. They were all wonderful Arabists. They knew the classical language inside out. Without that deep knowledge of Arabic, I think Professor Madelung would not have constructed his groundbreaking studies in the ways that he did. I would encourage any students or young scholars listening to emulate this now sadly lost generation in their dedication to learning classical Arabic, because without it, no one can be a true scholar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Montgomery. Lots in there. I'm thinking that if we were to use some of those modern tools that are fashionable today, about to create networks of scholars and relationship of medieval scholars, Professor Madelung would be connected to so many of us, and I thank you for making those connections and bringing all those other scholars. History as it really is, quite a statement.
Those are his words. I think in the dedication to the succession to Mohammad, he thanks his mother for showing him history as it really is. And so, of course, that's the other connection that we rarely mention in these sort of events. We've heard about Professor Madelung's wife and his son, but we all have parents who have produced us as the individuals that we are. That is why the German term Dr. Mutter or Dr. Vater is so evocative. It captures that unique scholarly relationship and maps it on to how we're all formed as individuals.
And of course, Professor Madelung had something conservative about him in the way he went about things, but he was also bold.
Yes,
very bold. And in his latest stage, some of the articles on the Ikhwan al-Safa or on Hamdan Karmat, he found evidence in sources, and because he was very certain about his Arabic and the sources that he knew, he knew where to take that.
Yeah.
In ways that others would have said, oh well, I only found that in one source, I'm not sure.
Yes. Yeah. All I would say is that you want an example of it. The very short preface, I think it's only 1,000 words to the succession to Muhammad. encapsulates all the weaknesses of those 2 decades of controversy that Hegerism had given rise to about the possible tendentiousness of the sources and the fact that we couldn't work with them. In the phrase reading between the lines, when you read that preface, other scholars would have taken a monograph to say as much as he does in that 1,000 or so words. Quite amazing.
Yeah, thank you. That's an invitation for everybody to read that forward as a primary work.
Yeah, I mean, it is a wonderful contribution to theory by denying theory, which of course is a theoretical position, and he wouldn't have liked me for saying that, because there were plenty of occasions when I tried to begin the conversation on those Monday mornings by saying something rather controversial as a rather hot-headed 22-year-old. But it is theoretically extremely informed, the whole book, and not just in terms of historiography, but in terms of hadith scholarship and in terms of codicology and paleography. It is truly a masterpiece.
The Daftary mentioned earlier in the video that we saw that there was a Persian translation. There's also an Arabic translation, which speaks to the impact and the reception that the succession to Muhammad has had. On a related note, I can announce to you that your connections to the project of the Khonasafa will continue to play out, because my translation of Epistle 9 should be coming out
Wonderful.
anytime soon.
Wonderful.
Now we move to a different area in Professor Madelung's career, which is his connection to Ibadi texts and the Ibadi conferences and Ibadi research group. Now, to speak about that, we have a pre-recorded video which has been sent by Dr. Abdul Rahman al-Salimi, who works at the Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs in Oman. We have subtitled the video to facilitate the audio and the understanding.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, I would like to thank the Institute of Ismaili Studies for this opportunity to join you in this Memorial Day, and Professor Farhad Daftary, along and common friends with me, and Professor Madelung, and also Professor Omar Alí-de-Unzaga for the opportunity to join you in this memorial. As we paid farewell today, I want to acknowledge the profound impact of my collaboration with Professor Madelung, WILFERD Madelung. I met him firstly in 1999 while I was working with Professor Fred Zimmerman and Patricia Kron, giving them I give them some copy of manuscripts while they are working in the Epistle of Salim with the Quran. Then we embarked our journey to exploring early Ibadi texts, theology, and literature in different fields. Of course, working alongside with the Professor Madelung was an honor and transformative of experience. I know Professor Madelung while I am working in my PhD earlier through his major text was benefit for me, the religious trends in early Islamic Iran, which is as a contribution to understand the development of early Islamic Iran in Iran. And the second, of course, Kitab al-Najat by Imam Ahmed Nasr al-Din, the Imam Zayn, who refute the arguments of Abdullah bin Yazid al-Fazari, the Ibadi theologian who lived in 2nd, 8th century. I immensely together we with the Professor Madelung, we delivered into cases of Ibadi thought, differing in its historical context and revealing the richness of theology and literary tradition. Especially, he was focusing on early Ibadi texts, which has been written in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century, about from 8th and 9th, 10th century. This is his major focusing, and we published several texts, and beside that he published many papers and studies published in several journals and books, editing books. And also with Professor Madelung, he was introduced me to the groups of Mu'tazili. Beside Professor Madelung, Professor Sabina Schmidtke and Groger Schwab, we are there establishing the Mu'tazili groups in 2003, and we work along how to edit the Mu'tazili manuscripts too. Professor Madelung also, he was the major contributor with and supportive for establishing the Ibadi conference, along with Professor Vanis and John Wilkinson, managed by Celia Francesca and supported by Heinz Gaube. All this was the beginning how developed the Ibadi studies over the last 20 years in Europe and globally. I am immensely grateful for this opportunity to have the work with the Professor Madelung. His guidance and experts have shaped my understanding of Ibadi studies. Of course, I am an Ibadi Muslim, but he is one of his guidance and leaving a lasting impression of my academic journey. As a part ways, I extend my heartfelt appreciation to Professor Madelung of our shared collaboration and the knowledge guided during our time. Farewell, and may our path cross again in the pursuit of knowledge and scholar inventors. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and wish you all my best to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. al-Salimi, for sending this. I know that you are traveling. For those attending in person, you can see some of the incredible Ibadi texts that have been published as a result of the collaboration between Professor Madelung and Dr. al-Salimi. Before we move on to Professor Walid Saleh, I have just been sent a note by Professor Ercilia Francesca, who has been mentioned by Dr. al-Salimi. So please allow me to read the note. Professor Ercilia Francesca is Professor of Islamic History at the University of Naples, at l'Orientale. Professor Madelung was a kind and a gentle person, as well as an outstanding scholar. One of his major works, The Succession to Muhammad, which is a milestone in the history of Islamic studies, inspired me in different ways during the early stage of my research on the beginning of the Ibadi movement in Basra. I met Professor Madelung for the first time in 2008 or 9 at one of the meetings of the Association for Ibadi Studies, which he supported passionately. In 2012, Professor Madelung attended the conference on Ibadi theology I organized at the University of Naples, l'Orientale. He was, together with his wife, an anthropologist, and on that occasion, he was together with his wife, an anthropologist. And on that occasion, they asked me to help them organize a trip to the sanctuary of the Virgin of the Ark to see the procession. I was very concerned about two elderly people venturing into a crowded and potentially dangerous place, but they insisted and eventually succeeded to go. This curiosity of Madelung for aspects even far away from his studies impressed me greatly. I find this same curiosity in his studies on Ibadism, to which he actively contributed, not only through his constant participation in the annual conference, as far as his health allowed him to, but also through the articles and the books he devoted to this subject. The editions of early Ibadi texts he published along with Abdurrahman al-Salimi, early Ibadi theology, 6 Kalam texts by Abdullah ibn Yazid al-Fazari, Ibadi texts from the 2nd, 8th century, and early Ibadi literature are sources of extraordinary value, not only for Ibadism, but for the whole early history of Islam as well. In his articles on Ibadism, Professor Madelung contributed to the analysis of the relationship between Ibadiyya and Mu'tazila in early Islam. The Ibadiyya and the Mu'tazila both arose as distinct religious and political opposition movements in Basra under the Umayyad Caliphate. They initially grew out of the same disaffected milieu, pursued a similar moderate path, seeking to reunite the Muslim community. As they spread their message, their identity became gradually more sharply divided, and they developed apart in different directions. An era has ended with Professor Madelung's loss. May he rest in peace. And this is the end of Professor Francesca's testimony. Thank you so much for sending that. May I take this opportunity to tell our listeners online that even though you cannot participate through the audio for technical reasons, you can add your questions in the question and answer section. And we indeed have already been receiving some questions which we are going to read. So now we move to Professor Walid Saleh from the University of Toronto. We can see you there. We hope we can also hear you. Please, Professor Saleh, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to have been asked to say a few words about the late Professor Madelung. I only met him a few times here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and he was always gracious and kind. But I know him mostly through his scholarship. I want to point to one aspect of his scholarship that made him such a giant in our field. His scholarship was widely impactful. By that, I mean that he was read by us all, something that cannot be said of most of us. Every scholar of Islam has not only read something by Professor Madelung, but more importantly, was deeply impacted. The work that was deeply influential on me was his monograph, The Succession to Muhammad, which has been mentioned repeatedly. It appeared in 1997 during my graduate years. I still consider the work to be one of the finest works in Islamic studies and in Islamic history. One can say much about the work, but to me, what was fundamental is how visionary the work was. It was the first historical work to give Aisha, one of the wives of Muhammad, a central role in the events, and also to argue that the two wives of Muhammad managed to wrestle a concession from Uthman, that their Quranic status as mother of the believers had political power. They ought to be consulted and, if I remember correctly, obeyed. And I hope my memory still holds true to the content of the book on this point. I always thought that this was the most feminist work on Islamic history. And I'm sure Professor Madelung would be amused to hear this. Every time a graduate student asks me what to read, I always ask if they have read this book. I always marvel at the moral courage of his scholarship. The work saw through the thicket of it all that Aisha and Hafsa were political actors of the first order, almost constitutional rebels, exegetes, and strategists. This was done long before it was fashionable to, in a sense, investigate the Islamic women's history. And to me, it remains far more profound in the way it did it than many works that followed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Saleh, and thank you for connecting in an early morning in Toronto. Thank you for your contribution. And we now move to two of our panelists or speakers in the room. The first one is Dr. Toby Meyer, who of course is a research associate, has been for a long time at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and who has worked with Professor Madelung on some texts. Please.
Thanks, Omar. Terse, industrious, acutely intelligent, rather shy, not an easy interlocutor, as the conversation quickly became a question of listening to the views he was sharing, but a very generous scholarly guide, for whom and from whom I felt palpable affection in more recent years. I've been exceptionally honored to have studied with a scholar of Wilfred Madelung's stature, and later worked with him on a number of book projects, primarily at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. It was all very fortuitous. During the early 90s, I was doing a 2-year MPhil at Oxford. And although Professor Madelung was not my main teacher, who was in fact Fritz Zimmermann, I did attend 1 or 2 text reading classes with Madelung. This led to having further sessions with him when I began my doctoral thesis, studying commentaries on Avicenna's Isharat. What I recall about those classes or supervisions is that he was mainly concerned to read the texts accurately and kept discussion minimal on the sometimes intractably difficult philosophical material. Though this could be frustrating for me, the experience was an incalculably rewarding education in Professor Madelung's approach to translating such like medieval Arabic texts. The guideline was to hug the Arabic and avoid taking liberties in the English translation. The objective was to produce a metaphrase and never a paraphrase. God is in the details, and one should avoid over-determining the meaning, because the detailed meaning might only come into clear focus down the line. Of course, the downside of this approach is the likelihood of rather inelegant English, but so be it. So this would have been in the mid-90s. Then there was a happy coincidence. Just as I was winding up my doctorate and my then wife was having our baby girl, it was Fritz Zimmermann who said to me, there's this institute in London, the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and you might want to find out if there are any openings for you there. And so it was that I applied and got a research associate position here at the IIS in 1998. This was exactly at the time that Madelung retired from being the Laudian professor at Oxford University and joined the IIS as a senior research fellow. He'd worked on producing a critical edition of Shahrastani's Critique of Avicenna, and my doctorate was partly involved, it had partly involved Fakhreddin al-Razi's critical commentary on Ibn Sina's Isharat. So there was a neat progression for me between the projects. I was asked to translate Madelung's critical edition of the Shahrastani Critique, and so was precipitated into a project working with Professor Madelung, my erstwhile teacher. This was amazing for me, very humbling and utterly fortuitous. In all, by the time of his passing a few weeks ago, I did 3 book projects with him. After Shahrastani's Critique, published in 2001, we did a second book on a fascinating text from 12th century Yemen, the Risala Mufida by Ibn al-Walid, which was published in 2016. This was a Tayyibi Ismaili commentary on a poem attributed to Avicenna, the Qasidat al-Nas, in which the soul is symbolized as a pigeon or an ash-gray dove, as Professor Madelung preferred to translate it. And this pigeon has lost its homing instinct, i.e. symbolically, we need similarly, as humans, to retrieve our homing instinct. There are, of course, some very esoteric ideas here, not least that the eminent Tayyibi commentator ultimately identifies the lost pigeon with not the individual soul, but the world soul, which has strayed down from its home in the divine presence. The idea that the very world soul is fallen is thoroughly Gnostic, with a capital G. And Madelung loved this text. Finally, we did a last book, which, although completed, has not yet been published. And this has already been referred to. This is a major 10th century text from Al-Andalus concerning Muslim alchemy. It is the Rutbat al-Hakim. It is indeed a precious item from the alchemical heritage of Arabic. And I should add that he developed the edition that's already been published by the Corpus Alchemicum Arabicum, which is on that table. And then I translated that into English. So it's a combined volume. Madelung was thoroughly invested in Maribel Fierro's hypothesis that the true author was Maslam al-Qurtubi. He evidently accepted the idea that this historically occluded figure of the 900s was responsible for this major alchemy text, also for the great text on astral magic, the Ghayat al-Hakim, which became famous in Europe as the Picatrix, translated into Latin. And finally, for the Risalat al-Jamia, which is an attempt to coordinate the thought of the Brethren of Purity in faraway Basra and produce a single overarching system of philosophy from their epistles. So on this view, Maslama is a great esotericist and philosopher of the 10th century who bore responsibility for these very weighty texts. Our completed volume on the alchemy text, the Rutbat al-Hakim, or rank of the sage, is lying with the Corpus Alchemicum Arabicum in Zurich, still awaiting publication. I glimpsed Madelung's surprising, perhaps deeper sympathies and personal enthusiasms when we were working on this text. In the middle of a meeting, when we had referred to Maribel Fierro's thesis on the authorship by the elusive Maslam al-Qurtubi, Madelung turned to me and said with the utmost seriousness, Maslama al-Qurtubi is my guru. Can we not perhaps say that his private sympathies partly lay with such esotericists and intellectual radicals? Certainly with Shi'ism, as evidenced by the succession to Mohammad, but these other aspects of his interests, I was pleasantly surprised by. Madelung was not just an assiduous researcher in that rare league of elite scholars of his time, or any time, but he was dogged in his routines. This became abundantly clear in his later routine as a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, until his health really failed him. But when he was already frail, around up till about 2019, he would still dutifully go from his flat at Belsize Court in North Oxford, all the way down to the IIS in London on Tuesdays. And this was a considerable journey for a frail elderly man. Not only did he insist on doing this every week, but for reasons I could never grasp, he insisted on doing this by bus on the Oxford Tube and not by train. And he would arrive at the IIS mid-morning, looking some days rather the worse for wear. It was touching and impressive, and sometimes quite agitating to witness the effort he put into maintaining this weekly routine, which only really ended with the COVID lockdowns. He and I had some lovely lunches on those Tuesdays in restaurants around King's Cross. And after a beer or two, he would talk rather freely about scholarly things, but also his life and family. Many thanks and God bless you. You're sorely missed, but what a legacy you have left.
Thank you so much for making those connections to between your studies, your scholarship, your place at the IIS, and that personal touch, which is very moving. Well, okay, we are getting close to the end, but we have two speakers. The first is Farouk Mita, who is associated to the University of Victoria, but also to the IIS, and has some thoughts to share with us.
No, thank you, Omar. I'm deeply honored by Omar's invitation to share a few memories of my encounters with Professor Wilfred Madelung since my first formal meeting with him in 1985 as a student in his weekly Ismaili Tech seminar at the IIS. That was the Great James Street building in Holborn. But first of all, let me confess, I feel like a bit of a fraud here because unlike the other speakers, I knew Professor Madelung from a distance and somewhat superficially. I could literally count on my fingers the number of very brief conversations we had together over the past 30-odd years. But perhaps the feeling of being a fraud is apt, since I have observed on several occasions, especially at conferences, how admiring scholars, even the accomplished ones, felt insecure in the presence of Madelung, as if they were being pretentious when speaking to Madelung about their relatively less path-breaking books and articles. Simply put, Madelung's remarkable body of work set the standard by which scholars measured their worth and competencies in relation to classical Arabic and Persian texts, and as intellectual historians, as the other speakers have also testified to it. So let me do some microhistory. The memory I want to share goes back to my first meeting as a student in 1985. I had fumbling Arabic then, and it's probably still more fumbling. Dr. Farouk Topan encouraged me to register for Madelung's seminar, even though it was for second-year postgraduate students. I think you felt sorry for me. You felt I was feeling a bit bored. I came with 2 years of Arabic from my undergraduate studies. And of course, Madelung was known to me, but not in any deep way. It was the Encyclopedia of Islam article and that really seminal 1977 article, God Beyond Being, which you all sort of like in samizdat fashion would pass around among the Ismaili students. By the end of the first class, I was relieved to discover that with the exception of 3 Syrian students, the level of Arabic of everyone in class was equally weak. We were 10 students in total. Madelung assigned passages from Abu Hatim Razi's Kitab al-Zinna and Abu Yaqub Sijistani's Kitab al-Iftikar. I'd never read such difficult Arabic texts, not only in terms of their complex syntax, but also in terms of their prior knowledge that these texts assumed about Fatimid Ismaili theology. And on first encounter, this theology can seem quite wild, especially if you grow up in somewhat of a sort of cloistered, pious background. Even the Syrian students suffered anxieties along with us every week in class, as we struggled to read and translate in front of the kind but serious gaze of Professor Madelung. I vividly remember perspiring as my turn came to read. Ironically, I also remember Madelung perspiring. This must have been due to the erratic radiators in that back seminar room with its crimson-colored carpet. Apart from discussions about the text, Madelung spoke of nothing else in class. As most of you know, and it's been said over and again, he was a man of few words. silent waters run deep. But when he spoke, the words were significant and diamond cut, just like his lucid and carefully crafted prose writing. We all survived the term, and on the last day of class, amazingly, Madelung graciously agreed to join us for tea and cakes, which included a box of mithai, Indian sweetmeats, brought by the Indian students. I half recall Madelung squinting when he was eating the mithai. I don't think he found it to his palate. Now, a few weeks before the tea and cakes class, I had come across the following long footnote in Marshall Hodgson's Venture of Islam, Volume 1, page 267. Quote, this is Hodgson, owe much of this discussion of early schools of thought to WILFERD Madelung, who has supplemented orally his discussions in the Imam al-Qasim ibn Ibrahim Undai Globensler der Zeiten. That's the 1965 book of Madelung. This is Hodgson continues to say, but he is not responsible for my interpretations. It is a rich, sound, thorough book which yields more than its title suggests. The footnote goes on, and you can read for yourself Hodgson's qualified signature opinions about the Murjia, the Qadaris, and so forth. But despite Hodgson's qualifications, he keeps praising Madelung. Further in footnote, Hodgson says, see his masterly appendices, indispensable to an understanding of early Muslim factions. I could hardly believe what I was reading. Hodgson was a scholar hero for my generation of students in Islamic studies. The book, his 3 volumes had just been published, maybe not even 10 years before. And as you know, Hodgson passed away suddenly in 1968, age 48. Then came the posthumous publication in 1974 of his glorious 3 volumes, Venture of Islam, which continues to inspire and provoke. Of course, for students and scholars in Ismaili studies, Hodgson's path-breaking 1955 monograph, The Order of Assassins, The Struggle of the Early Nizari Ismailis Against the Islamic World, was and is a classic. It almost had a talismanic sort of effect amongst especially Ismaili students. And if you don't know, for those of you, return to that book, see the last page and a half, the last 3 or 4 paragraphs, you'll be astonished, especially if you're an Ismaili. It's almost prophetic. It somehow seemed magical that the professor we met every week not only knew Hodgson personally, but influenced his scholarship. During tea and cakes class, I ventured bravely to ask Madelung about his relationship with Hodgson. Initially, he responded in short, clipped manner. Yes, he said, we were colleagues briefly at the University of Chicago, and then silence. Now, and looking back, I can sort of put the chronology together. They were colleagues for 4 years. Madelung arrives at University of Chicago in 1964, age 34, and Hodgson passes away in 1968, age 48. Hodgson is 10 years older than Madelung, but Madelung is precocious because Hodgson first publishes in 1955, both his book, monograph, and that famous article, How the Early Shia Became Sectarian, and Madelung publishes first in 1958. Undeterred by Madelung's reticence, and I was nervous, I nervously kept asking Madelung questions about Hodgson's personality and whether he knew that he was working on the venture, etc. Suddenly the dam broke, as it were. Madelung got animated and spoke to us spontaneously and with some emotion for perhaps 5 minutes about Hodgson, the man, the scholar extraordinaire, and Hodgson as an original thinker. He spoke about Hodgson, the devoted family man, taking care of his 2 daughters who kept ill. And I believe they had some congenital ailments and needed much care. How I wish I'd immediately written down what Madelung shared, especially when Madelung spoke about the book that Hodgson was working on before he passed away, which was not the venture, but a book on early Shia Gulat, building on Hodgson's article, How the Early Shia Became Sectarian. And Edmund Burke, the third, and Marilyn Walden have also talked about this book. So I wonder if there are still some things that are in manuscript that need to come about. Hodgson was taken away in mid-song, and now we can only imagine the loss of not having his book on early Shia movements. Madelung in many ways completed his rich multi-vocal song through his full, active, and long life. How sweet to imagine Hodgson and Madelung briefly riffing off each other on one song. But sweeter still to imagine that Hodgson and Madelung are together now, and that Madelung is enthusiastically making sure that Hodgson is caught up with all the happenings in Ismaili studies since 1968. Or do I mean to say 1977? For those who are listening, this is an inside joke. IS was established in 1977. Death confers authority on the departed, especially when remembering the achievements of extraordinary singular individuals. Professor Madelung's scholarly achievements are extraordinary, and I believe the singular authority of his work will come into sharper focus in the years ahead as the radiant circle around his work is complete and more visible. For me personally, something unexpected became visible several years after my little book on Ghazali was published. I learned through Dr. Daftary and Patricia Salazar that Madelung was one of the external reviewers, along with Professor Zayn Kassam of my manuscript. The wonder of how our relationship circles in life keep completing. Today, I'm remembering another beloved teacher, Zawair Moore, Dinan scholar extraordinaire, who is not keeping well. She would affectionately remind me, Farouk, there is wonder in how our circles of love keep turning and completing. And Omar, I can't give up this moment and say maybe there should be a conference on Madelung's work. It'll be very interesting to see how we would situate him as a historian of ideas. Clearly, he's on the other end of the spectrum when we compare him to Hodgson. But even when we compare him with Van Ness, how are they different? Van Ness is a bit more given to theory and speculation, and yet I feel there's deep theory in Madelung, and it's just there in a very it's there in this almost Sirmin Asrar way. I still remember Patricia Crone's TLS review of Madelung's succession to Mohammad. I don't know if you remember it, because I couldn't find the page. I don't know if my memory is playing games, but the headline, which is not possible to see now because we only have digital copies, was "Vive le Roi," long live the king. But I believe, it was a bit of a punchy review, but I know Crone and Madelung continue to collaborate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Farouk, for bringing such color and such, so wonderful references, and the references to Hodgson and those that imagining of the coming together of these giants, one gone young and one gone old. Yeah. Thank you very much. And finally, sorry to keep you waiting, Dr. Kumail Rajani. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation at the very last minute. Dr. Rajani, he works at the University of Exeter, and perhaps, and forgive me, but you represent, a new generation of scholars who are, up and coming with new projects, and we also wanted to hear your reflections on Professor Madelung's work. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Omar, and other team members who have organized this excellent event of paying tribute to Professor Madelung. Sorry, I was like a last-minute presenter, so I couldn't prepare something in writing, which I should have done it. But due to last-minute arrangement, you'll have to bear with me and for my couple of observations and contributions of Professor Madelung, which I want to share with you. I do not consider myself to be a colleague or even a student of Professor Madelung, as previous contributors were. Rather, I would like to call myself a student of the students of Professor Madelung. I have prepared a brief presentation, which I would like to share.
You can see that? Yes.
Yeah, so as far as his contribution and his impact is concerned, and as Omar said, I represent an emerging generation of scholars, and you could see by I had this audacity to ask Professor Madelung to take a selfie, and this is in 2013. when IS used to be at in Euston Square, near the Euston Square the building. This is a solo image picture in 2013. My journey starts with Professor Madelung from his article on the sources of Ismaili law. He wrote this article in 1976, before I was born. So that brings, like, you know, how a generation of scholars and their students would be inspired by the likes of seminal works which Professor Madelung has produced. James just mentioned to us, he had an advice for emerging scholars that the Arabic language has to, if they are working with primary sources, the Arabic language and the level of their Arabic language had to be, you know, to that par excellence. I would flip and I would request the senior scholars that no matter which topic or which subject they would touch upon, students like myself would come after, like, you know, 4 decades in my case, who would get interested in an article which was written 40 years ago before I started my PhD journey. So that's my journey with Professor Madelung as far as the sources of Ismaili law. When I met him for the first time, I said, like, you know, I was inspired by your article. I want to work further. He had his doubts.
Humayl, we've lost you on the screen for a second. Could you...
Dr. Rajani, can I ask you to stop for a second? We have some technical problem in the room. A jinn seems to have crept in and the screens have been swallowed by the ceiling. So...
You want me to stop share the screen?
It's overheating.
I think so.
Okay,
I
so
can't
there's an
override
overheating in the room.
Let me just message events.
Is there... Right. Daryoush and I were joking throughout the event through our WhatsApp link that everything was going well, and he kept saying, so far so good. And we knew a moment like this would arrive. So forgive us, Dr. Rajani.
That's fine.
But we try to, what do we do? Okay, is there a way to hear Dr. Rajani without the screen? So maybe I can turn one of these to the audience. And I think it's only a problem in this room. It's not a problem online, right?
Yeah, it's not a problem online.
So if I can, Ruth, if you can make...
I'm messaging
the audio of these iPads audible, then perhaps we can then play it from here. Is that possible?
I'm trying. Yeah, I'm going to ask.
Show captions, disconnect audio. Join audio. Okay, the screens have been done again. Can you say something, Dr. Rajani, so that we can...
Yeah, am I?
Okay,
can you hear me now?
Very faintly. So... we can argue as to the extent of the philological training of everybody in the room, but I can assure you that the technical training is very lacking. So we are trying to call for no teenagers,
no children and children travel. One of the laptops.
She's online.
Yes, we can do that, but the sound is very faint, so I'm not sure how to operate that. Where is the sound coming from? Because I can hear Dr. Rajani, but
is it better now?
Here. Okay. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can.
There we go. He's back.
Oh.
Okay.
Can you try to write the sound?
I think we're back, right?
Yes, we are back. I'm glad to report that this is our one and only technical mistake today.
Oh.
So please forgive us and restart from where you left, please.
Oh, That's wonderful. Sorry if I'm repeating something which I already said. In the interest of time, I'll keep it extremely brief. So my encounter, being familiar with Professor Madelung goes back to his first article when I was exposed to his article in 1976. I was just mentioning that James advised the younger scholars to how they should be investing their time, effort in learning the Arabic language if they are working with the primary sources. I would rather say that, and it's not an advice, it's just like, a request to senior scholars that if they are working on a particular text or a particular topic or a research interest, they want to be optimistic that down the line, it might take someone 39, 40 years, one would get interested in a particular item and they would build their entire sort of PhD thesis on it. So in my case, 1976 Sources of Ismaili Law was published. I started my journey in 2015, and it was just a short article where Professor Madelung introduces 21 sources, and I just wanted to expand on it and see like how we would be able to reconstruct these 21 sources which Professor Madelung has introduced, and later Professor Kohlberg and Paul Walker expanded on it. So that's one source of inspiration. My second inspiration comes from his second work. Second work in terms of my engagement with his works was Kitabul Munazarat of Ibn al-Haytham, and how that particular work reshaped, his work and Professor Paul Walker as co-editors and co-authors of the lengthy and elaborated introduction. So as far as contributions and impacts are like, we could go on and previous contributors have expanded in much detail. I would conclude with like two lifelong lessons, which I personally think has left an everlasting impact on my academic career is his meticulousness. Whenever you see Professor Madelung, he would come back and say like, oh, you come from Exeter. I read some work from one of your colleagues and like, it's Behbahani. It's not Behbahani, it's Bibahani. And I was like shocked. The amount of time, the amount of meticulousness, what Professor Amir-Moezzi mentioned, surgical precision. And he would be bothered if something has not pronounced accurately in Arabic, or if it's not transliterated in the way it should have been transliterated. So that's something which has lived longer throughout my encounter with him. And in countless book reviews where he would come back and point out like it's Ibn Ubdun and it's not Ibn Abdun, or vice versa. That's one lesson. The last lesson, which I think is his passion about research. As you could see in this interview, he mentions, I constantly find new meanings. So much of the early work, the texts are still unpublished. His Affirming the Imamate came out in 2021 when he was 91 years old. I could just expect that if I was to live that long, I would like to see myself editing, translating, or researching on various topics of interest and thus contributing to the field. May his soul rest in peace.
Thank you very much. It's been a long day, so we shouldn't prolong it necessarily. We do have a question, an important question in the chat from someone who knows the IIS very well in the library, Mr. Al-Nur Merchant. He's asking what happened to all the late Professor Madelung's original manuscripts and writings, diaries, correspondence, and letters. Is the Aga Khan Library, and more specifically the Ismaili Special Collections Unit at the IIS, seeking to acquire these materials so as to preserve them for future researchers and students? Indeed, should not the IIS and Aga Khan University seek to collect the personal and scholarly writings of prominent scholars in Islamic and Ismaili studies? So this is a very pertinent comment and question, and one that relates to one of the institute's, aims, which is to not only to be a hub for scholarship, but also to preserve scholarship. And I personally do not know. We know that Professor Madelung's son was, in charge of his papers, and we also know that Professor Sabine Schmidtke has visited and has received some of these materials, and it's probable that she will be doing something with some of that. I'm not really sure. She couldn't be here with us because of travel constraints, but I would like to send a call to any scholars and colleagues out there to perhaps gather any materials or any papers or letters that you might have that relate to Professor Madelung's legacy, even if they are personal. We heard from Paul Walker's letters, and immediately Professor Zayn Kassam was almost elbowing me to say that we should be publishing those. So a call to anybody to send along anything that you might have related to Professor Madelung, and perhaps the idea of a conference or maybe a volume, a couple of volumes, reflecting on his intellectual contribution as well as papers, could be a welcome contribution to the field. I think it only remains for us to close this event. I would like to thank all of the speakers and all of the audience for being so kind with your time. And please forgive us if we gave you very little notice, but we thought it was important to have this event before too long. We learned from Professor Madelung to acquire very good Arabic, to pay attention to sources which are still in manuscript collections, gathering dust or keeping away from bookworms. We learned from him to pay attention to the detail, to translate metaphrastically, not paraphrastically. Is that a word? And we also have learned from him to be generous and to be loyal. He has always been loyal to his connections and to the IIS in particular. And thank you, everybody, and thank you specifically to Dr. Daftary and Professor Kassam for your time today and for making this possible.
I would like to thank you and Daryoush for having organized this event so beautifully and so efficiently on behalf of it.
We have some small food outside, so please.
I am, yes. Yeah. If they're running probably 50 minutes.
How long is it? 15.
Oh, yeah. I had lapses. We had prepared to finish with an audio. It is 5 minutes, a bit long, but it is a continuation of the previous clip that we played. So please, David.
Acceptance and practice of the law required knowledge of it and of the revelation, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, insofar as it was based on them. Yet revelation was obviously not innate in human nature. Quran and Sunnah were a unique gift to Mohammed. Children born in Islam had to learn them from their parents or teachers, just as children of other religions were taught by their parents. Islam then was grounded in universal human nature, not in the particular revelation received by the Prophet Mohammed, which Islam embraced as it had earlier embraced the revelation of other prophets. Islam was not brought by Mohammed, rather it sanctioned his prophethood. Where then in the human fitra was the basis of Islam, recognition of the universal God, located? For most Muslims in the early centuries, it was in reason, in the human intellect. The Quran itself, of course, often appealed to simple reason, to common sense, in order to convey its message. And rationality, aql or nutq, was since ancient times seen as defining the human constitution. There were alternatives, however. The more mystically inclined might recognize the trace of God with their senses in perfect beauty, experience His majesty in states of ecstasy, or witness it manifested in the saintly life of an imam or a friend of God, a wali. For them, knowledge might be, quote, a dot that is multiplied by the ignorant, as a Sufi aphorism stated. Yet it was rational theology, the search for knowledge, which flourished first, and its leading school was constituted from the 8th to the 13th century by the Mu'tazila. Rational theology has in modern times become a stranger in religious thought. Not long ago, Pope Benedict XVI noted that there is indeed a legitimate theology called rational, with which presumably all reasonable people can agree. For most moderns in East and West, however, religion rather consists in revelation, in particular sacred scripture, and theology, both academic and popular, is interpretation of it. To study Judaism and Christianity essentially implies to investigate their respective forms of the Bible, and to study Islam means to examine the Quran. Reason and rationalism have taken a distinctly anti-religious turn in the West. Religion is commonly seen as requiring an initial leap out of common sense rationality into belief or faith, which in principle cannot constitute knowledge. From the point of view of the intellect, religion is located in the irrational psyche and at best deserves a skeptical approach. For many of those who view our modern age as post-Christianity, it ought to be eliminated from school and society in the interest of the advancement of science. For the Mu'tazila, religion was based on common sense rational knowledge. It did not imply a leap into some irrational belief. Faith consisted in recognition of a few basic simple truths readily accessible to any human compos mentis, and in acting in accordance with them. The existence of God, the creator of the universe, was known not by spontaneous intuition, nor by revelation, but by common sense inference from the perceivable world. His essential attributes, his being all-powerful, omniscient, and ever-living, could be easily demonstrated, as could his being neither a physical body in space nor an accident inhering in a body. These basic truths of the Mu'tazili principle of the unicity of God, the Tawheed, were also commonly upheld by other monotheist theologians, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, except for the literalist exegetes of Scripture. Rival theological schools employed substantially the same proofs for the existence of God and his transcendence of the material world. The difference was that they generally denied that there could be a moral obligation to acquire this knowledge before prophetic revelation, and that in fact the few humans would ever pursue it without listening to the warnings of the prophets. The Mu'tazila denied that the purpose of the mission of prophets was to convey or to summon mankind to the pursuit of such rational truth. The desire of their pursuit rather arose in childhood, long before the age of actual obligation, from a sense of fear of failing the obligation, of thanking the universal benefactor.
Thank you. This is part of a longer speech, which is available online through the University of California, Los Angeles, and it's freely available. Well, thank you very much for attending, and this is the end of our event. May Professor Madelung rest in peace.